Welcome to Mayhem CEDH, where questionable decks meet questionable pilots. For this week, we're jamming Baldur's Gate to see who brought the best commander from the set, or who managed to jam the most land destruction into their deck. Thanks, Evan. Thanks, me. With that being said, let's check out the pod today. First, we have Jack on Elminster Polymorph, a control deck that seeks to land Elminster, accrue value, and win with a Polymorph line. Randy on Minsc Go for the Eyes, a Gruul deck that seeks to use Minsc for damage, card advantage, and removal before finding a combo. Evan on Raggadragga Mana, a combo deck full of mana dorks and untap effects that combo with its commander. And finally, Josh on Nalia Stacks, a stacks deck that uses Nalia to gain value and win with Razakath or Abdul Reanimator lines. And now, with each pilot in their respective corner of the screen, let us begin. And for those of you in the Ames area, stick around to find out how you can get 10% off your next Mayhem Ames purchase. Randy draws and plays a Spire Garden. He plays a Raggadragga Tree Speaker and passes. Evan draws and plays a Stomping Grounds into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Llanowar Elves and also passes. Josh draws, plays a Verdant Catacombs and passes. Jack draws, plays a Marsh Flats and also passes. Randy draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, paying a life. In response, Jack cracks his Marsh Flats, paying a life. In response, Josh cracks his Verdant Catacombs, paying a life. Josh searches up a Scrubland, Jack searches up a Prairie Stream, and Randy searches up a Taiga. Randy levels up Raggadragga Tree Speaker and passes. Evan draws and plays a Concordant Crossroads. He plays a Fyndhorn Elves and passes. At the end of Evan's turn, Josh casts Entomb. It resolves, and Josh fetches up an Abdul Adrian Gorian's Ward into his graveyard. The turn moves to Josh. Josh draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, paying a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. He casts Demonic Tutor. Josh fetches up a card into his hand and passes. Jack draws and plays a Cephalid Coliseum. He plays an Azorius Signet, notes his lack of counter magic, and passes. Randy draws and plays a Carplusian Forest. He casts his commander, Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes. It enters and creates a Boo token. He upticks Minsc, giving Boo 3+1/+1 counters. He moves to combat and attacks Josh with Boo. Josh takes the hit, and Randy passes. Evan draws and plays a Destiny Spinner. He casts Gamble, fetching up a card into his hand and discarding at random, which is a Great Oak Guardian. Evan passes. Josh draws and casts Animate Dead, targeting Abdul. It resolves, and Abdul enters the battlefield, exiling Animate Dead and creating a 1/1 soldier. Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, and Abdul goes back to Josh's graveyard, which causes Animate Dead to enter the battlefield, which Josh targets to Abdul. Josh presents a loop of Abdul exiling Animate Dead, creating a soldier, Abdul going to the grave due to losing Animate Dead, and Animate Dead returning, bringing back Abdul. With this, he creates infinite 1/1 soldiers, granted haste by Evan's Concordant Crossroads. With this, the table sees the writing on the wall, and Josh wins the game. Randy draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Fyndhorn Elves and passes. Evan draws and plays a Grove of the Burn Willows. Evan, why? So much editing. He casts Llanowar Elves and passes. Josh draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts an Esper Sentinel and also passes. Jack draws, plays a Prismatic Vista, and passes. Randy draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Vault, not paying for Josh's Sentinel. He casts his commander, Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes. It enters and creates a Boo token. Randy upticks Minsc, giving Boo 3+1/+1 counters. He moves to combat and attacks Josh with Boo. Josh takes the hit, and Randy passes. Evan draws and plays a Firelit Thicket. He plays a Destiny Spinner. He plays a Birds of Paradise and passes. At the end of Evan's turn, Jack cracks his Prismatic Vista, paying a life and fetching up an island onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Josh. Josh draws and plays a Mana Vault. He casts a Damping Sphere and passes. Jack draws and plays a Mana Crypt, not paying for Josh's Sentinel. He plays an Ancient Tomb and also passes. Randy draws and takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Arid Mesa, cracking it, paying a life, and fetching up a Stomping Grounds onto the battlefield, untapped, paying 2 life. Randy moves to combat and attacks Evan with Boo. Evan takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Randy downticks Minsc, sacrificing Boo, killing Esper Sentinel, and drawing 4 cards. He plays an Orcish Lumberjack and passes. Evan draws and casts his commander, Raggadragga, Gorgut's Boss. He passes. Josh draws and takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Swamp and casts Blind Obedience. Randy and Evan sigh, Evan a little harder, and Josh passes. Jack draws and puts a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Elminster, and upticks him, drawing a card and scrying 2. Jack passes. At the beginning of his upkeep, Randy creates a Boo token, which enters tapped due to Blind Obedience. He draws and takes a damage from his mana vault. He plays a Spire Garden and upticks Minsc, giving Boo 3+1/+1 counters. He activates Orcish Lumberjack to help cast Vivian, Monster's Advocate. It resolves and Randy downticks Vivian. He exiles a red card from his hand to evoke Fury. Vivian's downtick triggers and Randy fetches up an Imperial Recruiter onto the battlefield, which enters and fetches up a Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker into his hand. Then, Fury resolves, deals 4 damage to Raggadragga, killing it, and sacrifices itself. All through, Randy passes. Evan draws, plays Marwyn the Nurturer, and passes. Josh draws and takes a damage from his mana vault. This is when Jack remembers his missed Mana Crypt trigger, which he rolls and loses. Josh looks at his hand and passes. At the beginning of his upkeep, Jack loses his Mana Crypt trigger. He draws and activates Elminster, drawing a card and scrying 2. He plays an island and casts Nexus of Fate. It resolves and shuffles back into Jack's deck. He passes the turn to himself. At the beginning of his upkeep, Jack wins his Mana Crypt trigger. He draws and plays a Prairie Stream. He activates Elminster, drawing a card and scrying 2. He casts Oath of Teferi. It enters and exiles Prairie Stream. He downticks Elminster, exiling the top card, which is a Tidespout Tyrant, creating 8 1/1 fairy dragons, and passes. Randy draws and takes a damage from his mana vault. He activates Vivian, creating a 3/3 beast token with a reach counter. He plays a Mana Confluence and casts Kiki-Jiki, Mirror Breaker, which enters tapped due to Blind Obedience. He moves to combat and attacks Evan with Boo. Evan takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Randy downticks Minsc, sacrificing Boo, dealing 4 damage to Elminster and drawing 4 cards. Randy passes. At the end of Randy's turn, Josh casts Entomb. In response, Jack casts Dispel, countering Entomb. The turn moves to Evan. Evan draws and casts Elvish Mystic, giving Marwyn a +1/+1 counter. He casts Radha, Heir to Keld, giving Marwyn a +1/+1 counter. At the end of Evan's turn, Josh casts Path to Exile, exiling Kiki-Jiki. Randy fetches up a forest on the battlefield tapped, technically, and the turn moves to Josh. Josh draws and takes a damage from his mana vault. He casts Imperial Seal. In response, Evan casts Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Kiki-Jiki of his own to the top of his deck. Josh fetches up a card to the top of his deck, loses 2 life, and passes. At the beginning of his upkeep, Jack loses his Mana Crypt trigger. He draws and plays an island. He casts Personal Tutor, fetching up a Time Twister to the top of his deck. He activates Elminster, drawing a card and scrying 2. He casts Time Twister. In response, Josh casts Silence, preventing his opponents from casting spells for the rest of the turn. Then Time Twister resolves, and everyone shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7 new cards. Jack upticks Elminster, draws a card, scries 2, moves to discard, and passes. Randy draws and takes a damage from his mana vault. He plays a forest and casts a Carpet of Flowers. It resolves, and Randy moves to his second main phase, adding 5 green through his carpet. He recasts his commander, Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes, creating a Boo token when it enters. He upticks Minsc, giving Boo 3+1/+1 counters, plays a Runic Armasaur, and passes. Evan draws and casts Ruination. In response, Jack casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Ruination. In response, Evan casts Autumn Veil. In response, Jack casts Swan Song, targeting Autumn's Veil. In response, Evan casts Pyroblast, targeting Swan Song. This is where Jack completely miscounts his mana and cheats. He casts Mana Drain, targeting Ruination. Ruination is countered, Swan Song is countered, Autumn's Veil resolves, and Fierce Guardianship fizzles. Defeated by Jack's poor math skills, I'm sorry, Evan. Evan passes. Josh draws and takes a damage from his mana vault. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Grim Hireling as it enters. He plays a Polluted Delta and passes. At the beginning of his upkeep, Jack loses his Mana Crypt trigger. He draws and adds 4 colorless through Mana Drain. He casts Hullbreaker Horror. It resolves and Jack follows it up with a Lotus Petal. Hullbreaker triggers, bouncing Damping Sphere. He casts Isochron Scepter, bouncing Blind Obedience with Hullbreaker. Isochron resolves and Jack chooses not to imprint. He casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Runic Armasaur, bouncing Mana Crypt with Hullbreaker. Armasaur is bounced and Jack recasts Mana Crypt, bouncing Lotus Petal with Hullbreaker. Jack presents a loop of casting and recasting Lotus Petal and Mana Crypt through Hullbreaker Horror, creating infinite colorless mana. He activates Elminster, drawing a card and scrying 2. He activates Elminster again, drawing a card and scrying 2. He plays an Odawara, Soaring City, and transmutes Muddle the Mixture. In response, Josh cracks his Polluted Delta, paying a life and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He flashes in Alms Collector. It resolves, and Jack fetches up an Arcane Signet through the transmute and casts Arcane Signet. Jack presents the same Hullbreaker loop, but this time with Arcane Signet, generating infinite colored mana with the last bounce trigger bouncing Alms Collector back to Josh's hand. He casts Time Orb, bouncing Elminster through Hullbreaker. Jack presents a final loop of casting and activating Elminster, drawing a card, then bouncing it with Mana Crypt, drawing his deck. With Jace, Wielder of Mysteries in the 99, the table sees the writing on the wall, and Jack wins the game. For those of you in the Ames area who stuck around, come to Mayhem Comics in Ames this week and ask for the YouTube discount. You'll be asked the question, who won Game 1? Answer correctly and get 10% off your purchase. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to catch future videos, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.